So I just read Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights for the third time, I think. I read it once in high school, then after, and now I've read it again. So it's surprising. Usually, when you're forced to read something in high school, especially as a sort of a class novel, you hate it. But for whatever reason, I absolutely adored it. I think the teacher must have done a really good job. She was from Northern England, so I wonder if that played a part in it, or sort of her love of the setting, the author, what have you. Yeah, it's a really good book. It's got beautiful prose. The story's wonderful. The characters are wonderful in how horrible they are. It's just a classic in every sense of the word. So it was written in the mid 19th century, but is set in the late 18th century. Very similar to sort of Jane Austen era, but is written quite a bit after Jane Austen. And the sort of layout of it, it's very neat too. So it starts with this man, Mr. Lockwood, who is arriving at Thrushcross Grange, which is such a fun place to say, Thrushcross Grange. A sort of place that he's renting for a year because he wants to sort of get away from society. And he talks about this girl that he was in love with, and she sort of came onto him, and then he sort of backed off and got scared, and so she was like, oh, I guess he's not into me, and left. Anyways, he's like, I'm done with society. I'm going out in the middle of nowhere to stay for a bit. And on arriving there, he goes and visits his landlord, who's also the next door neighbor, this guy Heathcliff at Wuthering Heights. And he goes up to Wuthering Heights and he meets this guy Heathcliff, who is super inhospitable. And there's also a sort of a young woman living there, and there's this other young man and servants, and he's gets mixed up about who's related to who and what's going on. But basically the whole situation is that everyone there is just absolutely miserable and hates one another, and they do not want Mr. Lockwood there. He gets stuck and has to sort of stay overnight, and eventually comes back home, or back to Thrushcross Grange, and gets sick from the cold and from being out trying to travel back and forth. And that's when the sort of the housekeeper of Thrushcross Grange, this woman Ellen Dean, or Nellie Dean, total gossip, reveals the whole thing to this guy. So it tells the whole history of Heathcliff and Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange and everything that happened. So that's sort of the way the book's laid out. We are introduced to this setting and introduced to the characters, and then we need to find out, how did we get here? And who are these characters? And how did they end up in this miserable situation? Then we have Nellie's story, where she lays out the whole thing. She's in her mid-40s at this point, maybe even a bit older. She sort of grew up with Heathcliff, as a bit older than him, not much older, but kind of like older sister range. Anyway, she tells the story of these Earnshaws, the Earnshaws of Wuthering Heights, who, they seemed pretty normal. They had two children, this guy Hindley and daughter Catherine. Catherine and Hindley, they're not great kids. They're kind of brats. But this one day, their father, Mr. Earnshaw, is going off to Liverpool, and he asks, what would you like for a gift? Hindley wants a violin, and Catherine wants a whip. And what does Mr. Earnshaw come back with? But he seems to have misplaced the whip, and the violin has been crushed, and he shows up with a boy, this sort of dark, they describe him as a gypsy, this boy that they decide to name Heathcliff. And why he's decided to take this orphan in, who knows? There could be sort of hints that it's his child, and the mother had died, and so he's taken this boy in, although that introduces some very weird incest things. So I just like to assume that for whatever reason he brought this boy Heathcliff into the family. And that's sort of where the trouble starts, as it is. For whatever reason, the father dotes on Heathcliff to the extreme and really favors him even over his own children. I guess he sort of adopts Heathcliff as one of his children. And so Hindley despises Heathcliff and treats him horribly. But Heathcliff's not just a victim. Heathcliff is also a horrible, horrible person, and gives just as well as he receives back to Hindley. Threatens to tell father on him. And one time they get a couple horses, and Heathcliff's goes lame. So he says, Hindley, switch with me. I want yours. You have to take my lame one. And he's like, if you don't, I'll show these bruises that you give me. And of course, Hindley beats the crap out of him, but then of course gives him the horse because he doesn't want father to find out that he's beating his sort of favorite child. Catherine, she's also quite problematic, very full of herself, very proud, very mean-spirited. And Catherine and Heathcliff really get along. They're like super close friends. They spend all their time together. Hindley's a bit older, so he's sort of separate from them. But anyways, at one point, Hindley gets sent off to go to college just because there's so much fighting and problems going on. So it seems great. Heathcliff and Catherine are left to themselves, enjoying life. And one day they sort of stumble down to Thrushcross Grange, which is a nearby house. And inside they find the Lintons. We have Edgar and his sister Isabella Linton. And they're a much sort of more normal family, but they're also seen as sort of weak and soft and sort of kind of pushovers and whiny kids. Anyway, the dogs get let loose because there's people outside the house. Of course, it's Catherine and Heathcliff, but they don't know that. And Catherine sort of gets attacked by the dogs. And once they find out who it is, they take Catherine in and sort of baby her and bring her back to health. And so she stays at Thrushcross Grange for a while, getting to know Edgar and Isabella. Heathcliff has to go back home. He's quite cross that they've sort of taken his playmate away from him and he doesn't trust them. And he's like, what are they up to? Mrs. Earnshaw has died at some point. Lots of people die in this book, which I guess is kind of normal. It's very strange, the world we live in now, where if anyone dies under the age of 60, it's sort of horrible. Whereas in this book, death can come at any age. I mean, the author herself, Emily, died at 30, I believe, or 29. And same with her sisters. And 19th century was rough. And all of human history before that. So let's see if I can keep the timeline straight in my head. At some point, Mr. Earnshaw gets sick and dies quite a while after his wife. And sort of on the day of his death, Hindley shows up with a wife, Frances, and they sort of take over Wuthering Heights, reduce Heathcliff to the role of a servant, basically, and kind of he becomes a tyrant, Hindley does. They have a child named Hareton, and sometime after Hareton's born, not very long, Frances dies, so Hindley's left as a widower, ruling the house, trying to look after Hareton, who he doesn't really care for Hareton that much, and treating Heathcliff horribly. There's also the servant Joseph, who's there the whole time, who's this, his parts are written with a very strong, I assume it's a northern accent, although trying to read it literally, it doesn't sound to me like a northern accent, but maybe it's 18th century northern. It's very difficult to read. There's a lot of it that I just do not comprehend. He's super, super religious, but in the way that religious as in not a good person, just he really believes that everyone around him is an evil, awful sinner doomed to hell, and no one can keep up with him, and no one doing the right thing like he is doing, and he is just a miserable old person. Everyone in this book is a horrible person, by the way. Even Nellie Dean, the narrator, you can sort of get hints that she's like such a horrible gossip, and you know, she's kind of like I don't want to say a Karen type, but even though we're getting it through her POV, she's not a great person either. Anyway, so Hindley's now sort of running Wuthering Heights. Meanwhile, Catherine's kind of not fallen in love with Edgar, but she's started courting Edgar, and she tells Nellie that, well, I'm going to marry Edgar because Edgar's got lots of money and sort of good position in society, and it'll be great. And Nellie's like, well, what about Heathcliff? You and Heathcliff have been super, super close forever. And she's like, what do you mean, what about Heathcliff? I'm not going to leave Heathcliff. Heathcliff's always going to be with me. Like, you can't take me away from Heathcliff. Like, I'm going to marry Linton and still have Heathcliff as best friend. Sort of, I'm going to eat my cake and have it too. Which, you can't eat your cake and still have it, Catherine. So she's so delusional and self-centered that she thinks she can marry the man of her dreams while keeping her soulmate with her. Which, by the way, Catherine and Heathcliff are totally soulmates. Like, let me just read the way she describes her relationship and her understanding of Heathcliff. I cannot express it, but surely you and everybody have a notion that there is, or should be, an existence of yours beyond you. What were the use of creation if I were entirely contained here? My great miseries in this world have been Heathcliff's miseries, and I watched and felt from the beginning. My great thought in living is himself. If all else perished and he remained, I should still continue to be. And if all else remained and he were annihilated, the universe would turn to a mighty stranger. I should seem no part of it. My love for Linton is like the foliage in the woods. Time will change it, I'm well aware, as winter changes the trees. My love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath, a source of little visible delight, but necessary. Nellie, I am Heathcliff. He's always in my mind, not as a pleasure, any more than I am always a pleasure to myself, but as my own being. So don't talk of our separation again. It is impractical. So yeah, this girl she recognizes that her and Heathcliff, they're literally one to her. They are the same being. They cannot be separate. And yet she still is going to go off and marry Edgar Linton because he's got money and, you know, whatever. She's a gal. So she does. She marries Edgar. And this sort of breaks Heathcliff's heart, obviously. And, I mean, Heathcliff's been a miserable person forever, but he really becomes miserable at this point and starts sort of plotting his revenge, as it were. He also, of course, hates Hindley. At one point, because he's constantly trying to think, how can I get back at Hindley? And he's like threatening violence and murder and death on all and everyone around him all the time. He's a trash human being. But at one point, Hindley's super drunk because Hindley really gets into drink, and he's sort of Michael Jackson style holding Hareton over the railing and drops him. And Heathcliff just happens to walk by and automatically grabs and catches Hareton and sort of saves Hareton's life. And Heathcliff puts him down and then realizes what he's done. He's sort of, if he just wouldn't have caught him, Hareton would have died, and that would have like meant Hindley committed murder on his own son and would have destroyed Hindley, and everything Heathcliff would have wanted would have come to pass. So that one mistake just really eats at Heathcliff. But, he keeps visiting Catherine and Edgar, and at this point, Isabella Linton, so Catherine's sister-in-law, Edgar's sister, starts kind of having a bit of a crush on Heathcliff, and Catherine's like, girl, you're nuts. He's a horrible trash human being. Do not get with him. He will destroy you. You mean nothing to him, blah, blah, blah. And even though she's really putting Heathcliff down, she means what she's saying and she's honest about it. She recognizes how Heathcliff is horrible. Of course, she still sees him as herself because she herself is horrible. And she tells this to Heathcliff as a joke, and Heathcliff's like, oh, I would not want anything to do with that, like, wimp of a girl. Like, that's so gross. Like, really puts her down and is super, super mean to her. But then he starts thinking with his malicious, malignant mind and starts courting Isabella and runs off and marries her. Now, there had been a period of time, I've sort of skipped ahead, where Heathcliff had left for a bit and came back with lots of money. We don't know how he made that money, but he's kind of a rich guy now. Anyways, he runs off with Isabella and marries her, and Isabella immediately regrets this. She returns with Heathcliff much later, and Heathcliff sort of sets up residence at Wuthering Heights. Turns out that Hindley's been super into gambling, and Heathcliff has used this to sort of get Hindley to mortgage Wuthering Heights, and the mortgagee is Heathcliff. Heathcliff basically owns Wuthering Heights now because of the debt that Hindley owes him. And so he sets up at Wuthering Heights. He locks Isabella away, makes her stay there, doesn't let her go and see her brother because, of course, he hates her brother. And yeah, I guess the next big thing is Catherine gets pregnant. Catherine and Edgar have a baby, and Catherine's really sort of losing it at this point. She seems fine. She had been fine, but then Heathcliff returns and sort of re-enters her life against Edgar's will, and that sort of sets her going a bit bonkers. And they have this super, super passionate moment where they're just, Heathcliff and Catherine are together and they're holding each other and weeping, and Edgar finally kicks Heathcliff out, and that night Catherine gives birth to a daughter and dies soon after childbirth, just because, people die. And this just wrecks Heathcliff. Edgar as well is quite despondent. I mean, his wife died. He loved her as well. But Heathcliff has this line, I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul, which shows that he sort of felt the same way about how Catherine is his soul, just like Catherine thought that Heathcliff is her. This isn't a love story, by the way. I don't think this book is a love story. I think it's a hate story. They hate each other and everyone hates everyone. There is love in this hate story, but it is primarily a hate story. So Heathcliff is distraught. Too bad. Edgar's pretty upset, but he eventually sort of comes around and starts to cherish this baby that he also names Catherine, and starts looking after her, and she becomes sort of the apple of his eye, and spends the next decade plus, loving this girl and raising her and making sure she stays away from Wuthering Heights and doesn't know that it exists, doesn't go there, doesn't meet Heathcliff, keeps her separate. Now, her name is Catherine. It becomes very tricky. So she's Catherine Heathcliff, who was born Catherine Linton, because her mother was Catherine Linton, who was born Catherine Earnshaw, who was friends with Heathcliff. And then Heathcliff's son is named Linton because his mother is Isabella Linton, but his name's Linton Heathcliff, but his mother's actually Isabella Heathcliff because she married Heathcliff, but she had been a Linton, and that's why she named her son Linton. It's bonkers, but it still makes sense. Isabella, at this point, is also pregnant, and she uses this opportunity with Heathcliff's kind of distracted to finally escape, and she runs away and stops at Thrushcross Grange and talks to Nellie for a bit, and has finally freed herself from this super, super abusive relationship and flees down to London and gives birth to a son there, names him Linton Heathcliff, because of course she's Isabella Heathcliff, she's married to Heathcliff, but manages to stay apart from him, does not mention his father to him, keeps his father away from him, and again, these sort of 13 years of relative peace occur. And so, of course, if there's peace, nothing's really happening, and the story jumps ahead. We jump ahead to Isabella dying, and so Edgar goes down to London and gets Linton and takes him back to Thrushcross Grange, his nephew, to sort of look after him. And Kathy's delighted to have this playmate, this boy her age, and she really dotes on him. But the very next day, Heathcliff has found out that his son is now at Thrushcross Grange and that Isabella has died, And so he forces them to send Linton up to Wuthering Heights. Now, Linton is a miserable person. He's Heathcliff's son, but he's a very weak constitution, much like the Lintons, like his mother. He doesn't really have any of Heathcliff's sort of strength or burliness or looks, but he does have Heathcliff's sort of insane, evil maliciousness deep inside of him, and he's super selfish as well, and just self-centered, whiny little immature brat of a boy. And Heathcliff is just disgusted with him at this point. So in these 13 years, of course, Hindley has died due to sort of drinking himself to death, and Heathcliff has taken over as owner of Wuthering Heights. Hareton, so Hindley's son, is still living there, but Hindley has, I remember I wrote a paper on it, and I used the word degrade. I must have learned what the word degrade means. I used the word degrade like 50 times in this essay. Heathcliff has degraded Hareton. He's sort of using Hareton as revenge to sort of create in Hareton the most miserable, uneducated, blasphemous, rude little boy, this to sort of get back at Hindley for the way Hindley treated him as a child. So he's Hindley Earnshaw. He's the owner of the house ostensibly, but Heathcliff, of course, because of the mortgages or whatever, sort of runs the place. And Hareton doesn't even know that he should be the one in charge. Like at one point it says Earnshaw on the house, but he can't read, so he doesn't even know that his own name is on the house. Anyway, so this is the new playmate for Linton. So Linton gets put up there, and Heathcliff sort of says that Heathcliff hates his son Linton, this mewling little child. But Heathcliff is like gonna try and do his best to elevate this boy. He says something like, take the tin that is Linton and start trying to polish him up to make him shine as much as possible, while taking the gold that is Hareton and trying to tarnish and make him as ugly and miserable as possible. The metaphor's something like that. I can't remember the exact metaphor. And Heathcliff sort of appreciates and he doesn't love Hareton by any means, but he's like, man, Hareton is a good child. If he had been my kid, like, I would have loved that. So Heathcliff, he hasn't won yet. There's still Edgar Linton and Thrushcross Grange that's he sort of wants to get back at for, I guess, marrying Catherine and taking Catherine away from him. And then there's the young Cathy Linton, who he also wants to get back at, I guess, or he hates because of what she represents. And so he begins this long scheme to sort of not seduce, that's a weird word to use. He tries to sort of get contact between Linton and Catherine. Even though Cathy's sort of been kept away from Wuthering Heights, she manages to sort of sneak out a few times and finds out that Linton's staying at Wuthering Heights, and so they start corresponding and writing love letters to each other. And Heathcliff's really encouraging this love between Linton and Cathy, and he wants them to get married because of inheritance rules or whatever. If they're married, then he recognizes that Linton's not going to live long. Linton's very sick and weakly. He also recognizes that Cathy's father Edgar's not going to live long. So because of inheritance laws, if he can get these two to marry, Heathcliff will become owner of Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange, and sort of then triumph and have Hareton to degrade and like abuse, and then he'll fulfill all his dreams of being the most evil person ever, I guess. And that's exactly what he does. And at one point, Cathy's father is really sick and he's getting near death, and so Heathcliff sort of expedites things and manages to trick Nellie and Cathy into coming into Wuthering Heights. And once they're in there, he holds them prisoner, basically. It says, you will not leave this house until you marry Linton, and you will not see your father. Your father could die while you're in here, but you are not leaving until you marry Linton. Which, like, what an evil man. And so she, of course, relents and she marries Linton. And so she becomes Catherine Heathcliff. And she manages to finally sneak out and get back to her father, Edgar, just as he's dying, finally. And yeah, he does pass away. And so Heathcliff becomes sort of owner of Thrushcross Grange and Wuthering Heights due to his sort of son and his marriage to Catherine. I just want to read some of the prose because, again, this is beautifully written. So this is Cathy before she married Linton, when she still sort of has a crush on him and doesn't realize what a horrible person his father is. She's describing the differences between herself and Linton. She says, one time, however, we were near quarreling. He said the pleasantest manner of spending a hot July day was lying from morning till evening on a bank of heath in the middle of the moors, with the bees humming dreamily about above the bloom, and the larks singing high up overhead, and the blue sky and the bright sun shining steadily and cloudlessly. This was his most perfect idea of heaven's happiness. Mine was rocking in a rustling green tree with a west wind blowing and bright white clouds flitting rapidly above, and not only larks, but throstles and blackbirds and linnets and cuckoos pouring out music on every side, and the moors seen at the distance, broken into cool, dusky dells. But close by, great swells of long grass undulating in waves to the breeze, and the woods and sounding water and the whole world awake and wild with joy. He wanted all to lie in an ecstasy of peace. I wanted all to sparkle and dance in glorious jubilee. I said his heaven would only be half alive, and he said mine would be drunk. I said I should fall asleep in his, and he said he could not breathe in mine, and began to grow very snappish. So, like, what beautiful imagery describing the way these two people see the world, and also the landscape of sort of the Yorkshire moors. Just incredible. But yeah, all seems like it's going dreadfully. Linton doesn't last much longer. He eventually dies as well, and his father doesn't even care. And he's like, "Don't even bother me with Linton. Like, you're married now. You deal with him. If he dies, so what?" So he does die. And that sort of leaves us at where we start when Mr. Lockwood arrives at Wuthering Heights, and we have Heathcliff lording over all. Hareton, this sort of young man who really should be owning the place, but can't even read or write, and he's just super rude and curses and swears and has a thick sort of northern accent that he's picked up from Joseph. Miserable Joseph still there, thinking that sort of the end is nigh, and he's surrounded by evil heathens. And Catherine, now Catherine Heathcliff, sort of a prisoner as well, having her whole family has died, and she has no one to love and no one to love her. So Mr. Lockwood, he sort of recovers, and he goes back to Wuthering Heights, and he's like, "Hey, Heathcliff, I'm not staying here. This place is awful. This winter I just passed was awful. I was sick. Look, I'm going back to London." And Heathcliff's like, "Yeah, sure, but I'm not going to give you back your rent. Like, you're paying for a year. That was the lease." He's like, "Yeah, fine. No, I'm paying. Whatever. I'm just telling you, I'm going back to London." And so he leaves. And then in the fall, Mr. Lockwood is back up north meeting a friend, and he realizes, "Oh, I'm really close to Thrushcross Grange, and I'm still technically renting it, so I might as well stay there for the night and see how things are going." And he goes and alerts the people there that, "Hey, I'm going to be staying here for the night. Can you get the place ready?" And Nellie Dean's not there. He's like, "Well, hey, where's Ellen? I want her to fill me in on the hot goss. What's been happening?" And they're like, "Oh, she's up at Wuthering Heights." He's like, "What? Why is she back at Wuthering Heights?" He walks up to Wuthering Heights, and he sort of sees through the window Hareton trying to read and Kathy helping him out, teaching him how to read. And they're really being flirty about it. And he's like, "If I can read this, will you give me a kiss?" She's like, "Yeah, but you got to read it, you big dummy." And he's just like, "What is happening?" And they sort of leave, and he sneaks in the side way and sees Nellie, and Nellie's like, "Lockwood, you're back." He's like, "What the heck's going on here?" And turns out Heathcliff's dead. And so then she fills us in on what's happened in these intervening months, and how Catherine has sort of, by the way, this whole time, Hareton has super been crushing on Catherine the whole time. But because of his station, and she's sort of seen him as a servant and his degradation, he's been really proud, and she mocks him and makes fun of him that he can't read and that he's stupid. And Linton mocked him as well. So he was just like, but he still was like, he's in love with Catherine. Catherine eventually, trying to make the best, I guess, of a horrible situation, tries to sort of befriend Hareton, and tries to break the ice and give him books. And it's a long, slow process. Obviously, it doesn't just happen, but the two of them sort of, their relationship thaws, and they start getting closer and kind of fall in love. And of course, this just blows Heathcliff's mind. Like, all the work he's done to make all these people miserable, and now there's kind of going to be some happiness. Like, he is not having any of that. But Heathcliff himself is starting to change. He has these moments of rage, but then they sort of subside. And he reveals to Nellie that he no longer he still feels this hatred and everything, but he has sort of no ambition to follow through on it. He can't bring himself to do anything about it. He's kind of lost the will. And a deeper change comes over him, and almost a manic sort of insanity. He stops eating, and he starts smiling and being giddy, and everyone's like, "What has gotten into Heathcliff?" And it's kind of revealed that now this book also has a huge supernatural element to it. So at the very first, when Lockwood's at Wuthering Heights, sort of the ghost of Kathy, like the original Kathy Earnshaw, shows up, and Heathcliff bursts through the door and calls out to her. And there's moments when Nellie sort of sees people on the moors, and sort of ghosts are kind of real in this world, but real in the way that sort of magic is real in Lord of the Rings. It's not explicit, and it's not in your face, but it kind of exists in the background in an excellently written way. So it's kind of hinted that Heathcliff has sort of seen the ghost of Kathy, and she's sort of returned to him. And in seeing her, he doesn't really feel a reason to live anymore or fulfill his sort of mortal needs of eating and sleeping. And he gives all of his time and devotion to following this ghost of Kathy around, and he eventually sort of dies one night with the window open in Kathy's old room with the rain pouring in. And it was a shock, but yeah, he's dead. And so they bury him as he wished, right next to Kathy, who's buried next to her husband Edgar. And when Edgar had died and they'd buried him, Heathcliff had them dig up the grave of Kathy, and he'd opened the coffin and sort of laid with her, and had them rip one of the sides of the coffin off. And he said, like, when you bury me here, rip the side off my coffin and stick it next to hers so we can sort of be next to each other forever. Which is kind of beautiful, but they're still awful, horrible people. But I guess awful, horrible people still have soulmates and still fall in love. And so, yeah, Heathcliff is dead. Now that Heathcliff's dead, Hareton inherits Wuthering Heights. Kathy inherits Thrushcross Grange, and Nellie announces that in the new year they're set to get married. So it kind of somehow, despite the horribleness of the past generation and all the efforts of Heathcliff, everything kind of turns out all right, and they all live happily ever after. Well, those of them that are alive. Except for Joseph, he's probably still horribly miserable. And yeah, that's kind of the whole plot. And like I said, beautiful prose, beautifully written. It's a shame that this is the only book she was able to write. I haven't read any of the other Brontë sisters. I know that only Charlotte was the one that really lived long enough to produce quite a few books. I would like to read Jane Eyre, just get a vibe. I'm sure it's nothing like Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights is a very dark, violent book, but it's great. One of the greats. So that's Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights.